The thud came without warning. It was the sound of a suitcase hitting the hardwood floor upstairs, sharp and final, slicing through the quiet of the old Victorian house in Springfield. For Daniel Carter, it was the kind of sound that didn't just reach the ears, it landed in the chest. After decades as a teacher, he had learned to recognize trouble long before anyone spoke. That instinct, once used to spot a child's hidden sadness or a brewing fight in the schoolyard, now told him something was about to break. Daniel had been retired for years, but the echoes of his past still walked with him. He had been openly gay since the late 80s, a time when being himself meant swallowing insults, losing friends, and watching his own parents close the door on him forever. He knew the sting of rejection too well, the way it could seep into the bones and stay there, no matter how many years passed. But there had always been one thread left uncut: his son, Craig. Daniel had raised him as best he could after Craig's mother left, and when tragedy struck again years later, taking the life of Ethan's mother, Daniel stepped into the role of both grandfather and father without hesitation. He promised himself Ethan would never feel unwanted the way he once had. Upstairs, the air was tense. Daniel found Craig shoving clothes into the suitcase, his movements clipped and careless, as if the house itself was something to escape from. There was no eye contact, no pause, only a cold sentence dropped into the space between them. I need my freedom. No discussion, no explanation that could soften it. Ethan appeared in the doorway, still in the sweatshirt he wore after school, his face pale. He was only 13, yet in that moment his eyes carried something far older, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just a fight, this was an exit. Craig brushed past them both, the suitcase banging against the stair railing, the front door opening and closing in one fluid motion. His footsteps faded, but the hollow he left behind remained. For a few moments, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then Ethan stepped closer to Daniel, wrapping his arms tightly around him. His voice was small but certain. You still have me. We're still family. The words pierced Daniel in a way that wasn't entirely pain. They reached back through time, to a much younger version of himself standing in a similar doorway, watching his own parents turn away. That boy had been left alone with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and the echo of words meant to make him feel less than human. Now, holding his grandson, Daniel felt something shift. There was loss, yes, but there was also resolve. This time, no one would be left behind without someone to fight for them. This time, the door would not close. He didn't know yet how far that promise would be tested, or how cruel the days ahead could become. But he knew the bond between him and Ethan would not be broken by absence, or money, or the venom of prejudice. He had survived too much to let history repeat itself without a fight. And somewhere deep in that determination lay the first spark of what was to come, a fight not just for their own survival, but for their dignity in a world that had tried to take it from them before. If you've ever had to stand your ground when the people you love turned away, you'll understand what comes next. Follow Heart Stories for the rest of this journey, because what Daniel and Ethan faced next was more than betrayal. It was the moment they learned that family is not who leaves, but who stays when everything else falls apart. The days that followed carried a strange stillness. Craig's absence was not just an empty chair at the dinner table. It was the absence of footsteps on the stairs, the sound of keys at the door, the subtle weight of another presence in the house. Daniel found himself noticing the smallest things, the way the spare mug sat untouched in the cupboard, the quiet of Ethan's room when he was doing homework alone. One crisp October morning, Daniel sat at his desk to sort through bills. The habit had always brought him comfort. Numbers made sense, unlike people. But as he opened his online banking account, the screen seemed to tighten around the edges. The balance was a fraction of what it should have been. The college fund he had kept for Ethan, carefully built over years, was gone. For a moment, Daniel thought it was a mistake. He refreshed the page, checked again, but the numbers didn't change. A knot formed in his stomach. Ethan appeared at the doorway, drawn by the long silence. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boy's eyes flickered to the monitor and froze. His voice was careful, almost reluctant. He told Daniel he had suspected this could happen. He explained how he had seen his father, more than once, transferring money to a woman named Vanessa. She was Craig's new girlfriend, someone Ethan knew only from overheard phone calls and brief, sharp mentions. But Ethan had done more than just suspect. He had checked Craig's old phone, the one carelessly left behind in the rush to leave. On it were the confirmations no one wanted to find: screenshots of bank transfers, messages laced with plans for a new house in another state, words mocking Daniel's identity, the old rainbow leech living off a pension. One message read, accompanied by an emoji that made the insult sting sharper. Daniel stared at the phone in silence, feeling the weight of more than just financial loss. It wasn't only that the money was gone, it was that his own son had weaponized his identity, turning the truth of who he was into a blade meant to cut him down. For Ethan, the discovery had been its own kind of betrayal. He had come out as gay at school, one of only a handful brave enough to do so. He had faced whispers in hallways, notes in lockers, the occasional shove from someone who thought different meant lesser. But it was different when cruelty came from inside the family. Daniel set the phone down, his hands steadied despite the churn inside him. The money could go by and, perhaps, be rebuilt over time. But what had been taken from them in trust, in belonging, was not something that could be transferred back with a few clicks. The evening light slanted through the living room window, catching the edges of old photographs on the mantel. In them, Craig as a boy grinned beside Daniel, their faces lit with the kind of bond Daniel had believed was unshakable. Now, the images felt like artifacts from another lifetime, proof of something real, but irretrievably distant. That night, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his homework, Daniel noticed the way the boy's brow furrowed, his pencil pressing too hard on the page. It wasn't just algebra that made his shoulders tense. It was the awareness that the world outside wasn't the only place they had to defend themselves. Sometimes the battle lines ran through the bloodline. It was in moments like these that Daniel remembered the lessons life had forced on him long ago, that prejudice doesn't always wear the face of a stranger, and betrayal doesn't always knock before it enters. Ethan glanced up, and for a second, the sharp edge in his eyes softened. "We'll figure this out," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence carry the truth he knew well, that resilience wasn't born from the absence of hardship, but from the choice to stand even when the ground shook beneath you. In that unspoken agreement, they began to prepare not just to recover what was lost, but to confront the deeper wound that had been left behind. And somewhere in the quiet of that resolve lay a truth worth remembering, that strength is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let it decide who you become. The morning air held a sharpness that hinted at winter. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring at the neat stack of bills he hadn't yet touched. Across from him, Ethan was scrolling through his laptop with the steady focus of someone piecing together a puzzle. There was no rush in his movements, only a quiet determination. Ethan had always been quick to adapt, a survival skill honed by being one of the few openly gay students at his school. He understood how to navigate a world that didn't always want to see him, how to hold his ground without losing himself. Now, that same resolve was fixed on something bigger, documenting everything Craig and Vanessa had done. The pile of evidence grew steadily: bank statements printed in chronological order, screenshots from the abandoned phone, message threads with dates and times carefully highlighted. Ethan organized them into folders as if preparing for a school presentation. Except this was no classroom project. This was their case. It was Ethan who suggested they call Mark, a longtime friend of Daniel's. Mark had been a police officer before retiring, and more importantly, he was someone who had stood by Daniel during the hardest chapters of his life. Mark arrived that afternoon, his presence filling the kitchen with a calm authority. He took his time reviewing the documents, pausing only to ask a question or confirm a detail. When he finally spoke, his tone left no room for doubt. "This is theft, Daniel. And not just theft, there's fraud here too. You need to contact the authorities." Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. The idea of pressing charges against his own son went against everything he had tried to be as a father. He had spent years believing that patience, love, and a steady hand could bridge any distance between them. But looking at the pages spread across the table, he saw more than numbers and words. He saw intent, malice, even. "I don't want him in prison," Daniel admitted, his voice low. "He's still my son." Ethan looked up from his chair, his expression steady but not unkind. "If we stay quiet, they'll do this to someone else. And maybe next time, it's someone without the strength or support to fight back. People like us don't always get second chances when someone decides we're easy targets." The weight of those words pressed harder than any argument could. Daniel had taught Ethan about fairness, about standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. Now the roles had reversed. Ethan was the one reminding him that protecting someone didn't always mean shielding them from consequences. Sometimes it meant making sure they faced them. Mark leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "The system isn't perfect, Daniel, but there are ways to handle this that aren't about vengeance. This is about setting a boundary. It's about telling the truth and letting the truth stand." Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the invisible thread that tied past and present. He remembered the marches he had joined in his younger years, the protests where voices rose not to destroy, but to demand dignity. This wasn't so different. The stakes were personal, but the principle was the same: silence would only serve the ones who had caused the harm. That night, after Mark left, Daniel and Ethan sat in the living room without speaking much. The decision had been made. Tomorrow, they would take the evidence to the proper channels. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't erase the damage already done, but it would draw a line on it, one that said they were not to be dismissed, disrespected, or stolen from without answer. As the evening deepened, Daniel noticed Ethan studying one of the photographs on the mantle. It was a picture from the last Pride event they had attended together. Both smiling, the rainbow flag bright against the summer sky. Ethan didn't say anything, but Daniel understood the unspoken message. In standing together now, they weren't just trying to reclaim money, they were protecting the idea that their lives, their dignity, and their place in the world were worth defending. And perhaps that was the quiet education in all of this: that family, whether by blood or by choice, is not defined by the absence of conflict, but by the commitment to face it side by side. The first sign that their actions had found their mark came in the form of a phone call. Daniel had been sorting through a stack of library books in the living room when the shrill ring broke the stillness. He answered, expecting a neighbor, or perhaps Mark. Instead, Craig's voice came through, sharp and ragged. "They froze my account," Craig said without preamble. "Vanessa lost her job. The police are asking questions. Somebody's trying to ruin me." Daniel didn't respond right away. He glanced toward the dining table, where Ethan was bent over a sheet of paper, pen in hand. The boy looked up just long enough to slide it toward him. In neat, deliberate letters were the words, "Not ruining, just taking back what's ours, and what they mocked us for having." Craig's voice on the other end grew louder, layered with the panic of someone realizing control was slipping. "I know you've got something to do with this. After everything I've been through, you're really going to turn on me." Daniel kept his tone even, almost quiet. "After everything, Craig, I'm finally choosing to protect what matters." There was no shouting, no rushed defense, just the kind of finality that comes when a line is drawn. Craig's response was an abrupt click as the call ended. A week later, the knock came at a strange hour, too firm to be a neighbor. Through the front window, Daniel saw two officers standing by a patrol car. Across town, another team was doing the same at a rundown motel. That was where Craig and Vanessa had ended up, far from the new house they'd once planned, the walls around them now bare and temporary. Reports later confirmed what Daniel and Ethan already knew: the investigation had moved quickly because the evidence was airtight. Bank records, message logs, and witness statements had painted a picture too detailed to ignore. The officers at the motel had found Craig and Vanessa together, their belongings in disarray, as if they'd been preparing to leave again. When the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Craig's confusion seemed genuine. Even then, he didn't understand that this was the natural end to the choices he had made. Vanessa stared at the floor, her silence speaking louder than any denial could. Daniel didn't go to watch. He stayed home with Ethan, both of them sitting in the kitchen where the case had first been laid out. They didn't speak much, but the air between them felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. For Daniel, the moment wasn't about triumph. It was about the strange ache of knowing justice sometimes comes wrapped in sorrow. Craig was still his son, the same boy he had once carried on his shoulders at the park, the same boy he had defended against cruel neighbors. But the man he had become had crossed a line that couldn't be stepped back over. Ethan seemed to understand this without needing it explained. He didn't celebrate or gloat. He simply returned to his homework after the officers left, his posture calm but resolute. To him, this wasn't a victory over a person, it was a victory over the belief that people like them could be taken advantage of without consequence. That evening, Daniel stood by the window, watching the autumn leaves gather along the curb. The street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after something decisive has passed. He thought about the protest he'd marched in during his youth, the times when justice felt distant but still worth chasing. Back then, the fight had been about visibility and rights. Now, it was about safety and respect within the walls of his own home. And perhaps that was the lesson beneath it all, that justice isn't always clean, and it rarely feels like a full restoration. It comes with its own costs, and it demands the courage to accept them. But even with the ache it leaves behind, it can close the door on harm, making space for something better to take root. 6 months passed, and winter slowly gave way to the first warmth of spring. The case was over. Some of the money was gone for good, tangled in debts and expenses that could never be traced back. But a portion had been recovered through restitution, enough to secure Ethan's college fund once more. The number in the account was smaller than before, yet it carried a different weight now. It was no longer just money. It was proof that they had stood their ground and been heard. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. Daniel found himself spending mornings in the small garden behind the house, trimming back the winter growth, planting herbs in neat rows. Ethan joined him sometimes, though his days were busier now. He had joined the Gay Straight Alliance at school, a small but determined group that met weekly to share stories, plan events, and support students who needed a safe place to breathe. One afternoon, Daniel attended one of their meetings. He sat in the back, listening as Ethan stood at the front of the room, speaking with a calm confidence that reminded Daniel of the boy's mother, measured, thoughtful, unwilling to let fear shrink his voice. Ethan told their story, not as a tale of loss, but as a warning about manipulation and a testament to the strength that comes from solidarity. They didn't just take money, Ethan said to the room. They tried to take trust, and trust is harder to rebuild than any bank account. But we can rebuild it together when we decide not to let people like that define who we are. The students listened closely, some nodding, others scribbling notes. Daniel could see the quiet recognition on their faces, the way a truth spoken out loud can make someone feel less alone. At home that evening, they cooked together, the kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, the rhythmic sound of knives on the cutting board, and the occasional burst of laughter when Daniel pretended to scold Ethan for sneaking bites before dinner was ready. On the table, next to the salt and pepper, was a small rainbow flag Ethan had placed there weeks ago. It stayed, not as decoration, but as a declaration this was a safe place, a home that no insult or betrayal could undo. Over dinner, they spoke about the future, college applications, possible summer jobs, maybe even a road trip when school was out. Daniel felt something he hadn't in months, the ease of planning without the shadow of uncertainty hanging over every thought. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting long streaks of gold across the kitchen, Daniel realized the truth he had been circling since the day Craig left. Family was never about who shared your blood. It was about who showed up when you needed them, who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. He thought of the marches in his youth, the moments when he'd locked arms with strangers to face down hostility, and how those moments had shaped him. This fight had been smaller in scale, confined to their own lives, yet the principle was the same: silence invites harm. Action pushes it back. As they cleared the dishes, Daniel glanced at Ethan and knew the boy would carry that principle forward. Not because Daniel had told him to, but because he had lived it. And maybe that's where the real change begins, not in grand gestures or sweeping victories, but in the quiet certainty that you deserve to stand in your own space without apology. Now, as their lives moved into this new chapter, one question remained, not for them, but for anyone listening. When the people closest to you cross the line, will you stand up for what's right, even if it costs you? If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, make sure you subscribe to Heart Stories, share this video, and leave your thoughts below, because your voice might be the one that helps someone else find the courage to fight back.